Okay, now this is going to be part 3 about blood from the lecture series From Mouth to Mitochondria. So if you haven't seen parts 1 and part 2 before, you probably should. It'll be easier for you to follow, okay? My name's Pete Rogers. I did a fellowship in vascular interventional radiology, imaging guided surgery at Harvard back in the 1990s. I've been interested in natural sclerosis a long time, written numerous books and book chapters about it. The level I'm speaking to you here is above the level of Harvard fellowship trained doctor in vascular specialties, okay? This is beyond them. This is beyond all the textbooks. It's beyond the Harvard textbook of cardiovascular pathophysiology. All right, so I want you to know that. That's why if you talk to one of these guys, they won't know it. And then they're going to look in their book, they'll go, it's not in our books. And no shit, it's not in your books. Your books stink. But if you start reading the actual medical literature, you will see all of this is true, and it's much better than your books. Okay, so the next thing, too, is being a Christian enables you to be a better doctor and a better scientist, and I will tell you why. If you throw God out, that weakens your ability to think. It doesn't strengthen your ability to think. Atheism does not improve science. It weakens science because it makes you stupid. And atheism creates no incentive to tell the truth. There's no moral foundation. So we're going to talk about God whenever it's appropriate. So here is God creating the earth. And when God created the earth, he created life first in the oceans. The oceans have salt water. That's highly relevant because in salt water, you then form the first cell and has a phospholipid bilayer on its outer surface. In order to have anything inside that cell and maintain osmolality balance, you have to pump out the sodium and the calcium. Salt water's got sodium chloride in it. The salt water rinses against the rocks, calcium carbonate, the limestone, and that gives you high calcium in the water. You need to know that the extracellular space, the water in the extracellular space, is like salt water, high in salt, sodium chloride, and high in calcium from rinsing over the limestone rocks, the calcium carbonate. You have to know that. If you remember that, all of membrane physiology will be easy for you. And if you don't remember that, it'll be really difficult for it. So here's God designing the earth, making life in the oceans, okay? So here's life in the oceans, and again, the salt water rinsing against these rocks rinses calcium into the water. So the extracellular space is like salt water, very high in calcium, very high in sodium chloride. And now here's the actual numbers. Basically, they're about, think of just 10-to-1 ratio for the sodium and for the potassium. So sodium is 10 times higher extracellular space from the salt water. Potassium is the opposite. So it's the counterbalance ion. Is potassium is high inside the cell, and about 10-fold higher inside the cell than outside the cell. With calcium, though, it's an extraordinary gradient. Calcium is literally 10,000 times higher outside the cell than inside the cell in the cytoplasm. Okay. Magnesium is the counterweight ion to calcium. Magnesium is much higher inside the cell than outside the cell. All right, and you need that to run all these pumps. So about 1/3 to half of a cell's energy is for this sodium-potassium ATP pump. And potassium is pumped into the cell, sodium is pumped out of the cell. So you have to think of this pump as saying, get out of here, sodium, get out of here, you poor, violent, crazy person. All right, so that's the attitude towards sodium. You need to know that. The pump's saying, get out, sodium, get out. And what ends up happening is you then have 10 times higher sodium outside than inside. Sodium, you should think of it as like sort of a barbarian thug trying to break into the city, okay, trying to get into the cell. And you can couple that desire of sodium to come into the cell to equalize its concentration gradient. It's also attracted towards the negative charge inside the cell. Plasma membrane voltage gradient is about negative 65 millivolts. And because of that, sodium wants to come in so strongly that you can use that to pump other things out. You can pump calcium out. You always are going to need some form of energy to pump calcium out because you're pumping against that 10,000 to 1 gradient. Okay, whenever you pump against a gradient, you need energy. Okay, that's going to be real important because calcium inside the cytoplasm is what activates a cell to do whatever it does. And inside the cell, your main positive ions are your sodium and your potassium. And these are about 98% of your positive ions, and the amount of them together is constant. So if you ever get more sodium inside the cell, you're going to have less potassium inside the cell. It has to be that way because it has to maintain its osmolality. If you had elevated positive ions inside the cell and elevated osmolality, the water would rush in and make the cell burst. So you're always going to maintain that osmotic neutral gradient, in any type of prolonged sense. All right, so now what is calcium? The way to think of calcium is like my ex-wife. Calcium is the female matriarch, the boss of the family. She's a prima donna, pain in the ass, bitch, who is not reasonable. When calcium comes in, it says, do what I say, okay? So mama comes home from a long day of work. She's pissed off. She says, hey, you were supposed to clean up the dog crap. Clean it up now, and yells at one of the kids. Then she says, hey, you were supposed to do the dishes. Do the dishes now. Then she looks at me while I'm running for my office. You were supposed to clean the garage. Get over here. Clean the garage, okay? So here's Mama coming in, and there's Tata. He's really like the chump who pays the bills, okay? She knows everybody, plans everything, makes all the phone calls. She wants to be the center of attention. She's jealous of Tata whenever he gets any attention. But anyways, remember that calcium is the female matriarch aristocrat who bosses everybody around, because that's what calcium does. As soon as calcium concentration in the cytoplasm rises, it makes the cell do whatever that cell does. If it's a pancreas, it'll secrete insulin. If it's a neuron, it'll release its neurotransmitter. If it's a vascular smooth muscle, it'll contract. You need to know that. Calcium, matriarch, bitch, unreasonable, bossy wife controls everything. Okay? And now, potassium is dear old dad. Working hard, the chump who pays the bills, makes the trains run on time, and he's just making sure things get done so everything's okay for the family. And then we're also going to talk about magnesium. Magnesium is the unsung hero. Okay, so magnesium is doing heroic things. This is Charlton Heston in the movie Ben-Hur hanging on to the horses. Magnesium, with its 2+ positive charge, is able to control the outer phosphates on ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the molecule of energy in the cell. These phosphates have negative charges, want to break apart from each other because negative charges repel each other, but the magnesium holds them in place, like Charlton Heston holding on to the horses in the chariot race. And that's important so it doesn't prematurely split apart, so that you can harvest this energy in a useful fashion. So remember, M for magnesium. It mellows a person out, and it's a hero, okay? That'll make sense in a moment. Here's magnesium. It's also a guard. It sits in the side of the NMDA channel for glutamate, and it blocks it. The magnesium, with its 2+ positive charge, is attracted to the negative normal charge, baseline charge of a neuron, a negative 65 millivolts. And when it's taken up the center of the NMDA channel for glutamate, which is a calcium channel, it prevents calcium from getting into the cell. So that's what you want. That's why it's called M for magnesium. M for mellows a person out. That's also part of why plant-based diets, which have a lot of magnesium, mellow people out, because it's harder for calcium to get into this postsynaptic neuron and activate it. Okay, so you need to know that. Magnesium is the hero. Okay, and you want to know where magnesium comes from. Where does magnesium come from? Magnesium comes from chlorophyll. Magnesium is located in the center of chlorophyll. So when you eat the plants, you get the magnesium. Okay, now you need to know the personality of sodium. Sodium is the angry poor, the barbarians, the Visigoths, trying to sack the city. And they're trying to burst into the city, coming over the barrier. And once they get in, they cause trouble. All right, now don't get me wrong. In controlled amounts, you can let them in, make them do some labor, cheap minimum wage labor, but then get them out. Okay, as soon as their shift is over, get the F out, get them out. Okay, because you don't want sodium accumulating in the cell. All right. So here's how a normal cell works, does its daily business. When it wants to do something, it lets calcium come in, let's say through the NMDA receptor. Calcium concentration goes up, and it causes that cell to do whatever it's supposed to. Like if it's a neuron, it'll release its neurotransmitter. If it's a vascular smooth muscle, it will contract. Then the sodium gradient is coupled to pumping the calcium out, like the NACA exchanger, Na for sodium, Ka for calcium exchanger, abbreviated NCX. Okay, so you have to have all these gradients correct in order to make this work. The ATP pump helps establish the gradient, and it requires ATP. You need energy to pump against the gradient to pump all these sodium out. And you can see 10 to 1 higher potassium inside the cell than outside the cell, 10 to 1 higher sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. The ratio in diet of potassium to sodium is called the K factor. And at a minimum, it should be at least 5. Ideally, it should be at least 10. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Okay, so when you eat food, we're going to talk about the K factor. Vegans eat tons of potassium, so it's very easy for them to have normal blood pressures. Meat eaters can barely get by, but once you add a little processed food, they're screwed. Okay? Our ancestors probably ate about 20 to 1. Now here's some K factors. In general, fruits tend to have very high K factors, 100 to 500. Okay? Tons of potassium. So think about that, 100 to 500 times more potassium than sodium. So they're very good for controlling blood pressure. The next in line is the starches. Starches tend to be anywhere from about 20 to 60 times more, or 20 to 100 times more potassium than sodium. So starches are good, and because they don't have quite as much potassium, some people like them for kidney failure patients. But the bottom line is starches are very good for preventing high blood pressure. All right. Then you got veggies. Veggies are more like around K factors of 5 to 15 or so. Okay. So that's what veggies will do. Meat is bad. Meat will have K factors, like 4 or 5, something like that. But then take a look at all these processed foods. So here's ground beef, has a K factor of 4. All these processed meats are crap. You don't ever want to eat that stuff. Okay, and Cheerios, the processed cereal, has a K factor of 1.2. Any K factor below 5 is bad. You really don't want it. Cheetos, K factor of less than 1. Potato chips, K factor of less than 1. These are terrible foods. Special K cereal, K factor of 0.06. Terrible. Okay, soy burger, K factor of 1.6. These are all really bad. So you can see the best food for preventing high blood pressure is going to be your fruits, then your starches, then your veggies. Okay? So you want to remember that. That's useful to know. Okay, I'm also going to show you, here's the Kempner diet. Kempner is Walter Kempner, MD. He was the guy curing everybody back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, including patients with systolics in the 200s on their hypertension. And what did he feed them? He fed them a diet of rice and fruits primarily. Okay, and that was 95% carbohydrate, 4% protein, and only 2% fat. You're not going to have blood sludge rouleau formation with only 2% of calories from fat. Okay. Notice also he didn't give them any amino acid supplements. He was feeding them only 4% of calories from protein. That's extraordinarily low protein. We don't need hardly any protein. Okay. You need to know that too. So it's basically impossible on any naturally chosen diet to be too low in fat and too low in protein. Nathan Pritikin and Walter Kempner figured this all out many decades ago. That's why, whenever one of the high-fat phonies tries to tell you, old people need more protein for muscle mass. No, you need to exercise. People have done just fine with very, very low amounts of protein. Okay, in most plant-based diets, if you just randomly eat plants, you're going to end up around 80-10-10, 80% carbohydrate, 10% fat, 10% protein. McDougall's version with no oil, Esselson's version, you're going to be probably lower than 10% in fat. Okay, McDougall would say his diet probably was, I think, about 7% in calories from fat. My version of it's really about the same thing. Mine's all organic, though. It is going to be very low in fat, in that ballpark. My fat take is probably about 4%, and I think it's a good thing. I'm about 63 years of age. I don't have any of the chronic Western diseases. Look at how little fat there is in potatoes, 1% of calories from fat. Sweet potatoes, 1% of calories from fat. White rice, 1% of calories from fat. The lower the fat, the better. I jokingly call the high-fat phonies the guys that are recommending, omega-3s, which increase your risk of AFib and prostate cancer, or olive oil, which is terrible. I call them the high-fat phonies, okay? And then they might jokingly call me a low-fat fanatic. Good. I'm proud of that, because that's what opens up your arteries. Okay, lentils have about 3% of calories from fat. Black beans are about 4% of calories from fat. Okay, fruits are really, really low in fat. They're also real high in potassium. We just talked about that. And it's good to be low in protein too. These are all pretty low as well. Oatmeal is a little higher, about 15% of calories from fat and about 12% protein, but it's still a good food. If you combine that with other things, you'll be fine. But that's as high as I would go on the fat. I would never eat soy. Soy is toxic. It's got about 37% of calories from fat. It's a bad idea. And it's estrogenic, and it's usually not organic, and it's usually sprayed with glyphosate and who knows what other adjuvants. All right, so here's basically the Spartan vegan diet, my version of the low-fat vegan diet. First of all, at the bottom of the pyramid, if you will, is things like, managing your stress maintaining your friendships, your family relationships, be religious. All religious people are a lot healthier. Get your sleep, Get some sunshine, maintain your circadian rhythms, get some exercise, aerobic and strength exercise. Walking is good enough for aerobic. Starches should be the majority of your calories, then fruits, then veggies. The only supplement you'll need eventually is vitamin B12, the Spartan Vegan Pyramid of Health. Okay, and this is just showing you starches are really low in caloric density. Here's how it works in terms of caloric density. Oil is the worst, pure liquid fat, 9 calories per gram. Nuts and seeds are like 6 calories per gram. They're very high fat, 70 to 90% fat. The higher the percentage of fat, the fatter the population, and the more atherosclerosis you're at risk to have. Don't listen to high-fat phonies trying to tell you it's a good idea to eat all this stuff. It's a bad idea. Meat's about 4 calories per gram. See, these foods have a lot of fiber, so you're only getting in your starches about 1 calorie per gram of these, okay? And so that's what you want to know. These are low caloric density. I'm not talking about calories from fat here. I'm just talking about calories per gram of weight. And then veggies are even lower, 0.1. And because this stretches your stomach, provides early satisfaction and hunger. So this all makes you skinny. All right, and then things will start rapidly changing. Your blood glucose is going to rapidly come down. Your hypertension is usually going to rapidly come down, but if you got chronic calcified arteries and a loss of Winchell effect, it's going to take much longer to get your blood pressure down. Hemoglobin A1C comes a little slower, and then your weight comes a little slower. But all these things are going to dramatically improve typically. That's why you got to be careful and work with your doctor to titrate your medications, because you got a good chance to come off of them. So for Spartan vegan diet, I say it's like Genesis 1:29. Every plant on this earth I have put to be food for you. And I say you want to live like Adam and Eve, but keep your indoor heating and plumbing, and that's what makes you healthy. Okay, so that concludes this section on the blood for the lecture series from Mouth to Mitochondria. I hope you found that helpful.